Hi there. To anybody who's watching, my name is Giuseppe Vitale. I'm a current second year master's student at James Madison University, and I'm conducting a podcast today on the impact of disease on the outcome of the Revolutionary War. As a scholarly historian, I have a variety of expertise, the first of which is in British imperial history. I also study the history of disease in medicine. I look at the evolution of military history, and I also study some classical history on the side as well. The biggest reason for doing a podcast today is mostly because I think that podcasting has become a great medium for conveying historical knowledge and research. But I've also had some prior experience conducting podcasts in the past, and getting to know this sort of technology has been a really fun and interesting development for me. The first part of this podcast is titled, Let's Talk Some Statistics About Disease, which is something I really wanted to provide in terms of background on the true impact and potential influence on the outcome of the Revolutionary War. But before I get into those juicy statistics and other information that I have, I thought I'd give you guys a little bit of a vignette to start us off. November 1777. In a dilapidated house in Alexandria, Virginia, 3 men lay shivering on pallets of straw. 2 wore some tattered old clothes to ward off the late autumn chill. The third had only an old shirt and half an old blanket. They were weak. They were starving. They had smallpox as well, though. These men were members of the Continental Army's 9th North Carolina Regiment, newly assembled over the previous summer. And in August of 1777, they had refused to march to Virginia until they received the wages the Army had owed them. The labor action brought results. Money in hand, the men of the 9th Regiment set out for Virginia on September 1st. They halted at Alexandria several weeks later, and here, by the time they arrived, Dr. William Rickman had put hundreds of Southern recruits through inoculation, immunizing them to smallpox before they went on to join General Washington in the main army. This once banned procedure was now required under official military policy. And as autumn took place in Alexandria, susceptible members of the 9th North Carolina and 15 other Virginia regiments rolled up their sleeves and bared their arms for Dr. Rickman and his staff. The inoculations did not go well, though. The soldiers complained that after giving them the smallpox, Rickman had abandoned them, forcing them to go through the disease without medical support. The men of the 15th Virginia Regiment claimed that they had, quote, very little care and attention paid to them while under inoculation, end quote. And one of their officers said that he, quote, never saw Dr. Rickman in the barracks where his men were sick, end quote. The North Carolinians protested as well, with Colonel John Williams charging Rickman with, quote, great negligence and mismanagement, saying he had left the care of the soldiers to his assistants, all of whom were negligent and cruel, end quote. You know, throughout the entirety of the American Revolutionary War, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people, civilians and soldiers alike, from a pool estimated today to be of around 2.5 million people in 1775, were casualties of a massive smallpox epidemic that ran horribly rampant throughout North America, between the mid-1770s and into the 1780s. However, this has not even taken into consideration the thousands of Continental troops who lost their lives on the battlefield and others who were plagued by various types of infectious diseases and medical conditions as well. In fact, according to a variety of sources, between the years 1775 and 1783, Anywhere from 6 to 8,000 Continental troops lost their lives across the 13 colonies due to wounds sustained on the battlefield throughout the Revolutionary War. While on top of that, another 10,000 men died from diseases suffered from within their own military encampments. Now, outside of prisoners of war, the number of colonial troops who lost their lives in the American Revolution number anywhere between 16 and 18,000 total over the course of 8 years. Other sources have even indicated that out of the roughly 150,000 troops who fought in the Revolution for this soon-to-be newly founded United States of America, 25,000 of them perished in their service for the Continental Army. Now, these casualty and fatality rates are the result of a combination of, obviously, battlefield deaths, but in terms of the ones for diseases, a number of infectious diseases and very dangerous medical conditions plagued both sides of this deadly 8-year conflict. We have to remember that prior to the eruption of modern medicine and healthcare techniques, including effective vaccination, many diseases hit much harder than they do in the 21st century, and that's an understatement. An example of this variety of illnesses and medical conditions that plagued both sides of this conflict include everything from smallpox, which today has been effectively eradicated since the 1970s, dysentery, various venereal infections, typhus, which is otherwise known as typhoid fever, gout, along with other rheumatic diseases, frostbite, hypothermia, exhaustion, and starvation. Now, amongst the Continental Army alone, between July of 1775 and July of 1783, the lowest percentage of troops with some form of illness was at its lowest point in the spring and summer of 1781, with roughly 5% of the standing army being listed as ill for some reason or another. However, earlier in the war, especially in the winters of 1776 to 1777, and the winter between 1778 and 1779, those percentages rose considerably to roughly 35 or 36% respectively, meaning that at its worst, various illnesses and medical conditions sufficiently and significantly knocked out easily over a third of the colonial troops at certain points in time during the war. The first case study for this podcast is titled Washington's Continental Army and the Northern Colonies. And as always, I'd like to start with another vignette to lay the foundation. Now, on January 6th, 1777, His Excellency General George Washington wrote a letter to the Director of the Army Medical Department, Dr. William Shippen Jr., stating, quote, "Finding the smallpox to be spreading much and fearing that no precaution can prevent it from running through the whole of our army, I've determined that the troops shall be inoculated. This expedient may be attended with some inconveniences and some disadvantages, but yet I trust in its consequences will have the most happy effects. Necessity not only authorizes, but seems to require the measure. For should the disorder infect the army in the natural way, and rage with its usual virulence, we should have more to dread from it than from the sword of the enemy. If the business is immediately begun and favored with the common success, I would fain hope the soldiers will be soon fit for duty, and that in a short space of time we shall have an army not subject to this, the greatest of all calamities that can befall it when taken in the natural way." End quote. And, it should be noted that two major issues plagued this famous Continental Army that we've all heard about, led by George Washington throughout all of his campaigns. The first of that being that the changing of the seasons, especially the winter times up north, and the second being that of a multitude of diseases that plagued his army for years, including this dreaded smallpox, which had been inflicting, of course, as said earlier, a massive epidemic across the continent, typhus, scabies, and even dysentery. Now, before attempting to camp at Valley Forge for the winter between 1777 and 1778, Washington's army had roughly 17% of its men listed as sick or unfit for duty before the end of October, then 26% by the end of November, and finally, after arriving at the encampment in late December of 1777, that number had risen to 33%, or 1/3 of the standing army. Now, unfortunately for Washington, his hopes of inoculating his army for smallpox were delayed for an entire year. He wanted it earlier in the year of 1777, and unfortunately that did not occur until their stay at Valley Forge during the winter time between 77 and 78, which obviously caused a massive setback in terms of being able to conduct any military campaigns until the spring of 1778 at the very earliest. Now, following their arrival at Valley Forge, two important tasks needed to be taken care of so as to secure the safety of these soldiers from both the elements and, interestingly enough, each other. Now, the first was massive arrays of huts were constructed so as to keep troops at least 50 degrees warmer inside than outside during the daytime, and around 30 degrees warmer inside than outside at nighttime. Then, on January 9th of 1778, the commander-in-chief himself issued a general order, which stated that every brigade of troops must construct hospitals so as to counter the need to carter off soldiers to faraway towns across Pennsylvania, Delaware, and southern New Jersey. Now, he had already notified the Continental Congress regarding a lack of medical supplies and therefore needed to secure a means of treating men with various mild ailments, but also aiding the fight against growing desertion within the army because of that. Now, these hospitals that were constructed at Valley Forge, along with those utilized in the surrounding towns within Delaware, Pennsylvania, and New Jersey, had quite the difficult time treating soldiers who were sick from various illnesses, and that in and of itself is an understatement. Dysentery ran through a great number of soldiers stationed at the encampment, but typhus would prove to be the biggest problem for all of Washington's army, not smallpox. Unfortunately, mass numbers of troops who were being treated for lesser ailments contracted the disease from their bedmates, while newcomers to many of the surrounding hospitals in the area were forced to sleep in beds as someone who had just recently either received typhus or passed away from the disease. In one local hospital alone, on January 1st, 1778, it was recorded that 260 men were crammed into a small space, and that of those, 120 which were patients, 5 of them were nurses, and even a pastor had all passed away from typhus. The hospitals outside of Valley Forge contained almost 3,000 men by late 1777, with another 2,000 of them scattered across various small towns in Pennsylvania. Now, one doctor and surgeon who was serving with the Continental Army, Dr. Benjamin Rush, noted that whenever a hospital was removed in winter, 1/2 of the patients generally sickened on the way or soon after their arrival to the place where they were sent, and that there were many instances of patients with slight sickness who suddenly fell dead after being removed from a hospital, end quote. Now, another major issue, while not specifically disease related, but certainly something which had a multitude of impacts on the health and well being of Washington's troops, was the severe lack of supplies and disruptions in overall supply chains, which led to instances of starvation, a lack of fresh clothing being admitted, and increased exposure to the elements. Now, especially regarding the lack of warm clothing during the height of the winter months, one Continental officer noted in late January of 1778 that the New Jersey Brigade was, quote, truly alarming, and how the men grew, quote, more and more naked. This detachment, along with countless others across the encampment, suffered from a lack in everything from jackets, coats, and even blankets to keep them warm outside of their huts. And when discussing problems with starvation, beef was hardly available, let alone other forms of protein during these winter months. And historians have debated for years over Washington's potentially exaggeration of how bad the food supplies really were between late 1777 and into the early months of 1778. Washington is known to have noted in a letter dated 2 days before Christmas in 1777 that if conditions overall did not improve, the army would soon and could potentially, quote, starve, dissolve, or disperse. However, in order to gain a better understanding of how different medical conditions and types of infectious diseases may have burdened other colonial armies in the northern colonies during the American Revolutionary War, we have to examine some of the campaigns and other leaders outside of Washington. Okay? Now, for example, by late 1775, Washington deemed it of vital importance early in the war, excuse me, to capture the fortress of Quebec in British-controlled Canada at the time, so as to establish a potential 14th colony and maybe an eventual 14th state for this newly founded United States of America come 1776. Now, the only problem was one particular set of infections would really hinder the two main units who were sent north to accomplish this task, and those are rheumatic diseases. Even more unlucky for these men is the fact that two of their highest ranking officials, the, let's say, oh so famous and not really for good reasons, Commander Benedict Arnold, who would later betray the Continental Army and switch sides and fight for the British, who initially in 1777 was leading the Connecticut militia, and then the general of the Northern Army, Philip Schuyler, both dealt with differing forms of gout. Okay. Now, for Benedict Arnold, he had been suffering from acute attacks of gout since he was 32 years of age in 1772, and in fact, following the death of his wife in the summer of 1775, he became bedridden for several days at a time due to repeated attacks that would begin in his right foot, and this delayed the expedition of his troops north towards Quebec until September 19th of 1775. Next, we have General Schuyler, who had a long-standing battle with, quote, rheumatic gout, which began when he was only 18 years of age in 1751. However, he suffered multiple extended flare-ups in 1762, 1769, and finally between 1774 and 1775, the last of which unfortunately prevented his attendance at the First Continental Congress. Then again, on September 14th, 1775, he was forced to relinquish his command of the attack on the British-controlled Canada, and specifically Quebec, due to his feet becoming severely infected by rheumatic gout and causing him intermittent chest pains and fevers. Now, both the acute and chronic conditions these two men suffered were somewhat varied, but they clearly impeded the success of some of these earlier campaigns in the far north, especially this famed assault, unfortunately famed fail assault, on the Quebec fortress in the fall of 1775. The second case study for this podcast is titled British and Continental armies in the southern colonies. And as per usual, I'll start us off with a little vignette. On October 14th, 1781, during the first day of the siege at Yorktown, Virginia, one German Hessian soldier named Johann Ewald, who had been serving under British General Lord Cornwallis, stated how, quote, "I would just as soon forget to record a cruel happening. On the same day of the enemy assault, we drove back to the enemy all of our black friends, whom we had taken along to despoil the countryside. We had used them to good advantage and set them free, and now, with fear and trembling, they had to face the reward of their cruel masters." End quote. Now, while Lord Cornwallis was comfortably stationed in the Carolinas for most of the war until his defeat at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781, hundreds, if not thousands, of British troops under his command suffered many of the same fates as the very North American colonists whom they were at war with. Southern colonies presented a very different type of area to conduct warfare in. The springs and summers are longer. The climate is warmer. And that in and of itself, unfortunately, serves as a perfect space for certain infections and other diseases to flourish almost year-round. Now, obviously, while the cold was not a factor neither side really had to worry about in these southern colonies, the prevalence of mosquitoes carrying malaria became a major problem by the late 1770s and throughout the later years of the war. Alongside that, dysentery and a major lack in overall hygiene proved to be just as malicious in their effect on both armies, but especially on British troops, since many of them were confined to tight spaces as the colonials were. But when they were coming over via some of their fleets, this would cause a separate significant issue. For example, when surveying the British troops who had landed in Georgia in November of 1779, roughly 24% of the entire standing army there was registered as incapacitated due to illness, most likely a combination of both malaria and dysentery. In fact, according to a treatise written by British officer Robert Jackson, his very own 71st Regiment of Foot suffered from relapses of, quote, intermittent fever, end quote, and dysentery in particular. The following year, from January until March of 1780, anywhere between 13 and 20% of the British fighting forces across all of Georgia and South Carolina were listed as sick. According to both this treatise from Jackson and actually a diary of a Scottish grenadier named John Peebles, malaria and dysentery served as the two most dangerous threats to the health of British troops across the Southern Theater. However, 1780 and 1781 in particular would serve to be almost the worst case scenarios for both sides to have to grapple with, seeing both malaria and dysentery playing an even more important role in the outcome of certain military campaigns and even crucial battles in the later years of the war as well. For example, prior to the Battle of Camden, General Gates of the Continental Army foolishly marched his troops through mosquito-infested marshlands in North Carolina, leading to mass amounts of colonial troops falling victim to malaria. And then, in the fall of 1780, after a disastrous setback at Kings Mountain, Lord Cornwallis had lost a quarter of his troops and was forced to retreat back to Charlotte, North Carolina. However, he too made a grave mistake, marching his troops at the start of the rainy season into these large marshlands that become overgrown with mosquitoes, sickening not only countless British soldiers, but the general himself developed a horrible fever, all of which were most likely caused solely by infections of malaria. Then, in the summer of 1781, The climate proved to be, particularly muggy, and the hot summer forced hostilities to cease between both sides across the colony of South Carolina, forcing General Greene of the Continental Army, who was dealing with the malaria-stricken force, to take refuge in the countryside, and the British plagued army having to do the same. Yet it was Greene's defeat of British Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Stewart at the Battle of Eutaw Springs which set in motion the last major campaign of the war, which would obviously result in the surrender of Yorktown. But this last campaign just so happened to be significantly impacted by a multitude of diseases. Okay, we all know about the Battle of Yorktown. It's seen as the last major showdown between these large standing armies in the American Revolutionary War, and specifically seen as Washington's greatest success. But without the intrusion of malaria, dysentery, typhus, and even smallpox, the outcome of this famed battle may have had an entirely different outcome. First, malaria and dysentery together severely compromised the fighting forces of both armies at Yorktown, with some disparity but more widespread than many people would have expected. A great example of this is that before even arriving in Tidewater, Virginia, half of the Marquis de Lafayette's troops were not even fit for duty due to malaria, and all the New England troops who had accompanied Washington's army in their journey south, who had never been exposed to the disease at all before in their lives, caused them to contract it very quickly and shortly after their arrival down south. Now, on the opposite side, Cornwallis himself is believed to have not only been ill, but unfit for duty due to having contracted malaria. And on top of that, 16% of his troops defending that entire encampment were sick as well. Some more recent historical scholarship has even estimated that if you were to combine the number of those suffering from dysentery as well with those suffering from malaria, over 35%, over 1/3 of the entire British force at Yorktown were listed as ill at the time of surrender on October 18th, 1781. And to top it all off, Lord Cornwallis himself reported that his most significant reason for surrendering was due to the number of ill soldiers under his command, therefore showing a direct correlation between various diseases incapacitating troops and the impact that had on military decision making. Along with all that, there's a sufficient amount of evidence, at least at the time and from the American perspective, to support the possibility that Cornwallis attempted to utilize the mass numbers of African Americans who had sought out the British for protection as refugees and who were suffering from smallpox as a means of inflicting biological warfare on the attacking colonists and the surrounding civilian population. Following the battle, Thomas Jefferson would later estimate that of the 30,000 former enslaved peoples from Virginia who had joined the British armies in the South, 27,000 of them died from either smallpox or camp fever. Several months before the surrender, on June 24th, 1781, one Continental soldier from Connecticut named Josiah Atkins noted how Cornwallis had, quote, inoculated 400 or 500 blacks in order to spread smallpox through the country and sent them out for that purpose, end quote. And to truly formalize these accusations, famed patriot Robert Livingston would later write how during the Battle of Yorktown, the British, quote, took the greatest pains to communicate the smallpox to the country by exposing the dead bodies of those who had died with it in the most frequented places, end quote. The final section of this podcast is more of a conclusion, but it is still titled, Did Disease Really Make a Difference? And as always, and for the fourth and final time, I will give a little vignette to start us off. Dr. Tilton of Delaware, who was a graduate of the College of Medicine in Philadelphia, was surveying a hospital in Princeton, New Jersey between 1777 and 1778. Dr. Tilton himself was a victim and nearly died of hospital fever, and decided that it would be a good idea to provide an accurate description of typhus. His description ran as follows, quote, "The disease gave notice of its approach by a languor of the whole body, and the head felt it was compressed as in a hoop. The symptoms were treated by bloodletting and an antiphlogistic course. After some days, the pulse begins to sink, a dry tongue develops, followed by delirium, and the whole train of putrid symptoms supervenes. At this point, bloodletting must be used with caution, whereas it was helpful at the onset of the disease. Vomit was deemed excellent, as it opened and squeezed all the glands, thus shaking from the nervous system all the contaminating poisons before their impressions are fixed. However, when the fever is fixed, mercury is of the greatest importance. This remedy has the power of subduing all manner of contagion and all infections with which we are acquainted. Thus, besides syphilis, itch, etc. without fever, it is regarded as a specific in smallpox, measles, scarlatina, yellow fever, etc. Mercury set secretions afloat." End quote. Now, over the last several decades, countless historians have attempted to weigh in on the impact disease may have had on the outcome of the American Revolution, not including the accounts of those who served in the conflict who were fairly certain that several diseases were easily having a negative effect on both their abilities to accomplish missions and conduct military campaigns. That being said, considering everything that has been discussed so far, points to one clear conclusion. The United States may have been hindered at many points by a multitude of diseases over the course of the Revolution, yet with all the British Empire had to face as well, including the arrival of the French army and the French Navy, proved to be the true nail in the coffin come the 1780s. However, after expanding on the idea of whether or not both sides of this conflict were in some ways influenced by various medical conditions and viral infections, the short answer is a most definite yes. Personally, I believe the war maybe would not have lasted as long as it did, and dragged on for 8 dreadful years until 1783, had certain mishaps not occurred. One that comes to mind is the delayed and horribly uncoordinated invasion of Quebec. If it had not been as disastrous as it was due to two of the most important figures leading that campaign being dragged down by their own medical conditions, that outcome might have been different, but unfortunately it was not. Another great example is the rigorous encampment at Valley Forge between 1777 and 1778. Had that situation been better, had the inoculations of Washington's troops taken place in the wintertime before, or even during the spring and summer of 1777, providing him with a fighting ability during the wintertime and well before the start of 1778, may have made the biggest difference in the world. Finally, the disastrous surrender of Cornwallis's army at the Battle of Yorktown could have gone completely differently and may have lasted for much longer had a third of his troops not been incapacitated due to various ailments. And you have a whole separate issue of, were there other instances of biological warfare? I mentioned earlier that many American patriots assumed that Cornwallis was was intentionally setting out freed African Americans as a means of spreading smallpox, not only to the local communities around Yorktown and Williamsburg in Virginia, but also to Washington's Continental Army. And then even on top of that, Washington's army, combined with Lafayette's, were still dealing with massive bouts of malaria and other diseases because many of those troops had never been exposed to this southern climate before and were coming all the way down from New England. So in all, there's a lot of different moving parts when trying to answer did disease really influence the outcome of the war. And again, I will reiterate, I think that at the very least on a small scale, if not in terms of certain military campaigns, yes, it most definitely made an impact. It hindered both sides on multiple occasions, and specifically smallpox, measles, typhus, dysentery, starvation, all of those really did culminate at certain points throughout the war. And so much more can be said about all this, and there's such mass amounts of literature on this topic. But in the end, even if things had gone differently, I think that the war in and of itself was inevitably never going to be worth continuing on for too long for the British Empire. It was expensive. It was costing manpower that had to be drawn from other parts of the Atlantic world and from mainland Europe as well. And once the French got involved, that really cemented the kind of wiggle room that the British had. By 1781, especially after the surrender at Yorktown, it becomes very apparent, I think, disease or non-disease related, becomes very apparent to the British Empire that it's just no longer worth it, and that it would be more beneficial for them to take their losses with the 13 colonies, focus on control over the West Indies and Canada, and basically call it a day. And with that, hope you've enjoyed watching and listening to this podcast. I would love to do something like this again. If not, do a longer extended version of this. Thanks for watching.